All right, I'll go ahead and get started. And maybe as people join, we'll keep moving. But thanks everyone for attending today. Today's talk is going to be about investment dilution. It's the second to last in our Bench2Market talk series for this year. As a reminder, this talk series is put on by Biolocity, IBB, as well as the Georgia CTSA group. So as I mentioned, we're near the end of our talk series for this year. We've got one more talk coming up on June 1st. So I do want to highlight that. That'll be at 11 a.m. on June 1st. And I'm really excited about this one. This is going to be a life science funder perspective panel. We've got three VCs in the life science investment space that'll be giving a panel discussion on kind of what they care about, how they evaluate technologies, and how best to prepare yourself as entrepreneurs to approach investors. So you can find registration links for that on Biolocity's website. And as a reminder, some other commercialization resources available through Biolocity. We've got legal office hours with Emory School of Law professor Nicole Morris. So if you've got questions about intellectual property or governing corporate law for your startup, please feel free to make an appointment on our website. Additionally, we're part of the BARDA Drive Accelerator Network. And so this allows us to connect interested entrepreneurs to opportunities for health security funding through the government. I've listed a few areas of interest that Drive is currently looking for. So if you've got a technology that might fit into one of these, or you're just interested in learning more about BARDA, please feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to connect you to the folks at BARDA. Another resource that we're going to have through BARDA is some office hours. So please stay tuned. We'll have more information on this soon, but it'll be an opportunity for you to interface directly with some BARDA officials to learn more about their funding opportunities and kind of how that whole process works. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. James Stubbs. He is our speaker for today. We'll be talking about investment and dilution for early stage startups. He's a professor of the practice of the Georgia Tech Capstone, as well as a serial entrepreneur and a private investor with experience in multiple startup companies. And I'll let him give the rest of his intro. So I'm really looking forward to the talk today, and I'll turn it over to you, James.
Hey, let's get started. Thank you for all coming. This is one of my favorite talks I do because it really impacts you as a founder of a new startup company. It's really looking at a little bit of some of the basics for financing and what happens to your ownership in your startup company as you start to raise money from investors. So just a little bit more detail on me. So I am a professor of the practice, and that mainly means that I've spent most of my career out actually in industry. And my industry was the medical device startup community. Today, in addition to being a GT faculty member, I'm also on the board of two privately held medical device companies, one of which is here in Midtown, and the other one is up in Durham, North Carolina. And they're in the digital radiology space and in the orthopedic space. And I'll show you a little bit about what their products are in just a couple of minutes. The first company I started was called Radiation Dosimetry Systems, and we worked with radioactive drug companies and did software development. I was the founder and CEO of that company, but that's going back a long way. But as part of that, I was actually approached by the then first CEO of a company called Proxima Therapeutics, and they asked for me to come on board and try to help them develop some neuro-oncology and breast radiation therapy devices, which I did in fact do for them. So that was my first medical device company, and I came in as the second person and went and did a lot of the fundraising with the CEO, Tim Patrick. I was sort of the technical guy. He was the business guy. So when the VCs would ask questions about the clinical aspects, the technical aspects, radiological aspects, he would pass the ball over to me, and then I would answer them with really big words and stuff like that that would make him go, yeah, thank you, let's talk business instead. So I actually think I served that function pretty good. That company, after 8 years, was acquired by Cytec Surgical Products. They moved me out to Palo Alto, where they had their surgical products division just being started. And we built that from a 6-person group in the R&D space all the way up to a 24-person group in about 9 months. That was a great experience working for a big public company, but the biggest thing I walked away from that was, I don't want to work for big public companies. So that's a little bit about the bias you're going to hear from me, as I'm a small company person. I really like that space a lot more than the big companies, because we can pivot very rapidly when we see that something's not working the way it should, or if the market dictates that we need to do something different. We can do it much, much quicker in the startup realm. But after Cytec Surgical Products, They pretty much cut all of us loose after about 18 to 24 months and consolidated all of the California operations because they were so expensive there down to Costa Rica where they did the manufacturing or back to Boston. And so I was one of the 140 people who did not take their transition package. And 2 days after my last day at Cytec Surgical Products, I started Focal Therapeutics, which made a small bioabsorbable implant for breast cancer patients. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. I also served as the Chief Science Officer at Sienna Medical, which made breast radiation therapy devices as well. I started a company that did we were trying to do a class 3 medical device, an implantable neurostimulator for overactive bladder. And that's a class 3 device. And we were looking at having to raise 150 million to get that thing to market. Ultimately, we were not able to raise any money on that one, so we actually shut it down. So that's one case where I started something and I saw that it was uninvestable for a pretty good reason, and we shut it down. So I've seen both my startups get acquired and also just not make it at all. Then probably back in 2014, I moved over into the Atlanta Technology Angels and started the life science vertical. So they had originally done mainly financial technology, software as a service, and things of that nature, but they kept getting life science ideas coming through and they didn't know what to do with them. So I said, all right, well, I'll start a new screening committee and we'll just look at those specifically. And the first investment we made was in the OB Medical Company. And I became a board member since we syndicated it and actually pulled together a couple $1 million for that company. And this one actually ended up having to be a turnaround where, as a board member, I had to go in and actually remove the existing CEO and the COO and promote the chief financial officer and restructure the senior management team and get the company back on track. So I did hire a new CEO after 6 months, and we were actually able to bring that one home. So Proxima Therapeutics was acquired for about 200 million by Cytec. Focal Therapeutics back in 2018 was acquired by, I think it was Hologic, and that one was October of 2018. Sienna Medical, weirdly enough, got acquired 2 weeks later by Wright Medical, I think it was, or Merit Medical. And finally, OB Medical, that we all thought we were going to lose our shirts on, we actually sold it to Philips Medical. So all told, all 4 of those acquisitions came in at just over $500 million in terms of the amount of return on the investment that all of the investors and shareholders and employees all had. So pretty fun little career so far. So let's take a look at a couple of the products just real quickly. So this is for my first company, Proxima Therapeutics. And what you're seeing is a balloon catheter system that was used to deliver radiation therapy to brain tumors, malignant brain tumors like gliomas and glioblastomas. So that was our first product. We also created a product that was a variation on that, and it was to deliver accelerated partial breast irradiation to women who had early stage breast cancer. The nice thing about that product was it allowed the radiation therapy to be completed in 5 days instead of 5 weeks of daily trips to the radiation oncology suite. So that was a nice one. That's the actual product that got Proxima acquired, because we were doing about 12 million in revenue on it at its run rate when we got acquired, and we were doing about 4 million on the neuro-oncology products. It was clearly the breast device that was the driver of that acquisition. What you see in the purple over here, this is the BioZorb device, and this is what we created for Focal Therapeutics. And it has all of what you see that's sort of clear and shiny. That's a bioabsorbable polymer, and it's kind of springy. It looks like a spring, and it has that sort of springy shape to it. And it has 6 titanium markers, and you can see in the mammograms down to the left, here are the little markers over in this lateral view, and you can see the markers over here again. What this does is this provides a radiation therapy group a specific target to aim their beams at so they can do external beam radiation therapy in 5 days in these patients. The side benefit of this device is it actually takes up the space that the lumpectomy specimen the patient lost when the lumpectomy was performed, and it provides a better cosmetic outcome. So those were the two things that that product did. The companies that I'm on the boards over, Oxos Medical, and they have a digital handheld radiography and fluoroscopy system that's in use with orthopedic surgeons, and Restored, which is up in Durham, North Carolina, and they do custom 3D printed lower extremity, upper extremity, and spinal implants made out of both polymers as well as cobalt chromium metal. It's really, I think Restored is going to be a very, very disruptive company going forward, because it's almost totally vertically integrated, doing all of their own manufacturing. So that's a real big difference from all my other experience where we did outsourced manufacturing. So I want to give you a little more perspective on where I'm coming from, so that you always understand my biases, and I'm very, very transparent about that. I really loved my time as an entrepreneur, and it's really, what's so good about it was you bring new products to market and they have to solve real problems. And that's a unique thing that I think is true in our space, is it takes so much money and so much time to go through the product development in the design controlled aspects that the FDA requires, that you have to make sure you're solving a real problem and there's a real market for it. And if you do that, then more than likely you're going to be successful with launching that product. I absolutely hated fundraising. You know, I'm a bit of a, you may not believe it, but I'm a bit of a trained extrovert. I'm naturally introverted. So fundraising was a kind of an unnatural activity, but I've spent so much time talking to our customers, surgeons and radiation oncologists, physicists, that I've kind of gotten comfortable with that type of activity. One thing I do want to make sure that everybody in your position right now, that you understand, because I didn't know this when I got started in my career, other entrepreneurs, we're totally open to helping you out. You know, if you've got a question, you've got a problem, call somebody and ask them their experience and how do they deal with such and such problem. I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know people would answer those types of questions really, really openly. And consequently, I learned a lot of stuff the hard way. And so I'm trying to give back at this point in my career by being open and available to the entrepreneurs out there in the med device space, that I'd love to try to answer your questions and help you out. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to. My email address here is Stubbs, S-T-U-B-B-S, @gottech.edu. So the last thing I would just tell you is always remember that entrepreneurs, they're the ones that really create the value in this world, because we're creating things that are meeting unmet needs or gaps, for example, in healthcare. This is really, really important to remember. You know, we're not necessarily making new types of, you know, kids' toys and stuff like that. We're actually doing things to better healthcare, improve people's quality of life, and actually solve some real problems. And that really can help keep your drive level up and going as you move forward. And sometimes you get into some of the frictional or sticky places. So with all that in mind, we're now going to take a look at some of the more of the heart of what this talks about. We're going to start off with a little bit about corporate structures, and then how does that feed into how do you fund those corporate structures. So the first one, of course, is the LLC. And it's real common that these are used as startups. And this is usually only done for pre-equity financing. So that's when you first want to start it up, you want a corporate entity, you do an LLC. You know, you can get on the state of Georgia's Secretary of State website, and you can start an LLC for less than $100 in 20 minutes time spent. But there are some serious downsides to them, which I'll bring up in a couple of minutes. The second corporate structure is an S Corp. And an S Corp also will not be used for outside equity finance companies. So neither one of these are what you want to do ultimately when you're ready to go talk to investors and bring cash into your venture. They're both what they call pass-through entities. The profit and loss that is associated with those goes straight to the shareholders or the owners of those corporate structures. And there's some other things that come about because of that nature that most professional investors like VCs, they absolutely will not put money into either one of those types of structures. So instead, what you're going to do is a C Corp. And this is the form that will be required by any sort of professional investor, for example, venture capitalist. You may be able to do something with an LLC with angel investors, but if they're smart, they're going to make you swap it over to a C Corp pretty quick, and they're going to make you do it as a Delaware C Corp, which I'll touch on in just a minute. So one of the things to always remember is once you take money from an investor, their expectation is they're either going to make multiples on their investment, and especially with like angels and your Series A type financing, their target is a 10 to 20 or 25x return on their investment. So if they put in $100,000, they're expecting to get somewhere between $1 million to $2.5 million as the return on it. That's what they're expecting to do, or they're going to lose it all. And that's typically the two outcomes that you see. So it's probably if 10 venture capital investments are made, 7 of them will be total wipeouts. The investors will get no return whatsoever. 2 of them will get maybe break even, get their money back, but it's that 1 out of 10 that's in the portfolio that will typically maybe return a 10 to a 25x. That's the one that the investors are all banking on. So they expect you to do everything in your power to get them a positive return on that money. So once you take it from them, it's kind of set in stone that you're going to be moving forward, and you'll be moving forward really hard. All right, so let's talk a little bit about C Corps, because that's the place that you're going to be starting your company if you haven't already done it in that fashion. So the real benefits are for a C Corp is you can have an unlimited number and type of shareholders. For example, an S Corp, you can have no more than, I think it's 500 shareholders in an S Corp, but in a C Corp, you can have millions of shareholders. For example, Amazon is a C Corp, and they've got millions and millions of investors. You can have multiple classes of shares. So you'll have common stock, which is what the founders will have, and then you'll have preferred share classes. That's what the investors will have. So if you have venture capitalists coming in and funding your startup, the Series A round that you raise is going to be, you're going to be issuing preferred shares, Series A preferred shares to the venture capitalists or the investors in that round. And those preferred share classes have a number of benefits over common stock. You can also issue restricted stock. You can do stock option agreements and warrants, which are all ways that you can compensate your employees and have them share in and be incentivized in the same way that the founders are, and making sure everybody's sort of rowing the boat in the same direction. And you can use those also in lieu of some cash for some of the vendors that you may be, buying different services or things from. Now, there's also an entity called the Qualified Small Business, and the QSB is really cool, especially for founders, because it's a big federal tax incentive that's available. So if you start a company and you've got, say, 2 million shares of common stock, and it takes you 6 or 7 years or anything more than 5 years, and you have a liquidity event, which is you actually sell the company to a bigger company and they pay you in cash. If you've held that stock for more than 5 years, you actually don't pay any federal income tax on it, no capital gains tax. This is just a fabulous new rule that was put into place around 2014 or so. So this is a great way to really have big implications for your founders out there. VC funds will not invest in pass-through corps, which are the LLCs and the S Corps. And you can fully expect that any investor who puts money in your company is going to expect you to do a Delaware C Corp. And the reason for that is Delaware has the most business-friendly corporate tax law structure of any state in the country. Don't know why, but that's just the way it is. If you do a Delaware C Corp, you're going to have to be careful of one thing. You will have to file a state of Delaware tax return. And if your CPA's never done one before, they may look at it and say, oh, we got 10 million shares according to Delaware. Our minimum tax fee that we have to pay Delaware is like $185,000 because it's based on how many shares you have outstanding. But that's not what you actually have to pay. It's actually based on your assets. But if your accountant is not aware of that, you could get a big inappropriate surprise that could almost give you a heart attack. That actually happened to me. I saw that and went, oh, holy crap. And I did get my accountant to go back and look at it again and said, oh, no, wait a minute, there's an alternative. And we got that cleared up and ended up paying like $250 instead. So in terms of disadvantages, there's really none of any significant importance for the startup world. There's a little bit more to just keeping track of doing all of your board of directors meetings and all of the documentation that's associated with that, and just making sure you keep everything in good shape for that. But that's maybe just it. Pretty straightforward other than that. All right, so let's take a look at where you can get some of the cash that's necessary for you to operate your venture. Now, the amount of cash that's required by your company is going to depend on a number of different things. And in the healthcare space, it's going to depend on the stage of the venture. Are you really just at inception of the company, or have you already gone through and done your proof of principle prototype, or et cetera? It also depends on the regulatory and clinical requirements. If you're doing a phase 1 or a class 1 medical device, there's no clinical studies required. There's no preclinical studies required. So it's very short time interval to being able to start to commercialize. And there's not a lot of expense associated with those clinical studies. But if you're doing a class 2 de novo, you're going to have to do a safety and performance and maybe an effectiveness study before you actually get your clearance to start marketing your device. And if you're doing a class 3 device, you're of course going to have to do a first-in-man study, and you're going to have to do a pivotal study. And those are both very expensive and time-consuming. So that sort of goes to the clinical trial type and scope that you would need to be thinking about as you think about the product and the regulatory clearance pathway that you're going to have to do. And then you're going to need to look at the type of commercial launch. So once you have the government's permission to start selling your product, you need to think about how you're going to sell it. What's the distribution channel? And there's really just 3 different routes that you can go, and they have very, very different cash requirements. Employing your own direct sales force, that's the thing that I have direct experience with. You have direct control over them, you incentivize them, they own the customer. This is very effective from that perspective, but they are very expensive. So you have to raise a lot more money to do a direct sales force commercial launch of your product. More capital effective or efficient is to use distributors to sell your product. That really can save you a lot of money, but the downside to that is your distributors don't necessarily prioritize selling your product unless it's the most profitable product that they have that they're selling, because they're going to be repping a bunch of different products from a bunch of different companies. And you just need to make sure that yours is the most remunerative to them so that it stays at the top of their list of things that they want to bring forward to the customers. And you have to make sure that they're giving you the customer feedback on the things that they like and that they don't like, and what does the sales cycle look like. Those are things that if you leave it totally up to the distributor, you're going to get distanced from your customers to the point where you may not understand some market changes or some things that people are getting unhappy about your product. And that's really, really important to make sure that doesn't happen. And finally, you may have strategic partners at big companies. And I'll give you an example. We had an equity investment at Proxima Therapeutics from Ethicon Endosurgery. And as part of their investment, they got the rights to sell our product in the United States. So they had a transfer pricing, I think it was like 50%. So the sales price was $2,500. They got to buy it for $1,250 from us, but it was their responsibility to go sell it. And that actually did not work very well for us. And we ended up bringing that back in and putting on our own direct sales force. And that was much more successful for us. And finally, there's 2 types of cash or 2 types of financing that I'm sure you've been hearing about. One's non-dilutive financing and the other is equity financing. When you bring in equity-based financing, that means your ownership stake is going to get diluted by the fact that you've got new investors coming in and they're going to be shareholders of the company. We'll talk about each of those in a little more detail first. And do feel free to ask any questions that you may have along the way. John can interrupt me and ask me the questions, and we'll go ahead and try to answer them on the spot, or we can try to go over some questions at the end too. But for non-dilutive financing, this is money that you would get from foundations, grants, friends, family, where they're not expecting to take an ownership stake in the company that you started. You can have state level grants, like here in Georgia, we have the Georgia Research Alliance. So they can do phase 1, phase 2 grants, and they have venture debt as well. And it's just an awesome way to pick up some non-dilutive funding, meaning the money comes in, you do not issue stock to those entities in return for that money. And then there's a small business innovative research and the STTR grants that come from, typically for us, they're going to come from NIH or the National Science Foundation. Every single federal agency has to offer SBIR and STTR grants, but for us in healthcare space, those are the two agencies we're typically going to go after to try to get that type of money. There is an SBIR grant expert over at ATDC. Her name is Connie Castile. And if you haven't heard of ATDC, it's the Advanced Technology Development Center. It's in Tech Square. You need to go find and talk to those people, because they have a lot of entrepreneurs and residents in the healthcare space who have direct experience, having gone through the process you're going through or starting right now. And Connie Castile can help you find a request for proposal for an SBIR grant that will be responsive to your technology and your offering. So it's a great person to get to know as quickly as you can. All right, now we're going to move on to the dilutive types of financing for your venture. And the first one we're going to talk about is a convertible note. Now, convertible note, and I am going to discriminate this from a safe note, and I'll hit the safe note next. But the convertible note is a debt instrument, and it carries an interest rate. The typical market on that right now is like 8 to 10%. There's a cap and a term associated with it. And I'm just going to use a couple of numbers as examples. A $4 million cap, that means that whatever money that this convertible note has, when it converts into the shares at the next equity financing, they will get a share price that does not exceed a value of $4 million for the enterprise. This is a way for the early stage investors to actually get a better return because they invested earlier than the people like the Series A preferred that would come in a little bit later, where the company's actually increased in value. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that later. Now, those investors also will get a discount on that conversion to equity. So they either get the cap or they get a conversion. So typically 10 to 20% is a pretty typical type of discount that's on that conversion. And in some cases, the payment being made, principal and interest, will be payable at the next equity financing. But I would tell you, this almost never happens. And this is essentially means that you would have just taken a loan out from somebody who gave you a convertible note. If that's what they want to do, that's fine. But most early stage investors like angels who use convertible notes, what they want to do is the second bullet point. They want the principal and interest to convert to the stock type of the next qualified financing, which is typically going to be, hopefully, a Series A preferred round. So their money that they put in the convertible note will convert to preferred stock when that next financing happens. Now, well, that's actually what this point says. So when that conversion happens to the Series A, the debt actually gets wiped out, meaning you had some long-term debt on your balance sheet, and now it gets converted over to equity, and you no longer owe that money back to the investor who put it in. So it's, as a debt instrument, it's wiped out at the point that it actually gets converted. Now, I would tell you that convertible notes, how they can have a very complicated effect on your cap table computations, especially if you have multiple convertible notes with different terms on them, such as one's based on a pre-money value, one's based on a post-money value. They got different discounts, different caps, things of that nature. So you really do have to be careful about that. And a lot of that issue has really caused a lot of folks to prefer, especially entrepreneurs, the safe notes, which we'll hit next. So you can consider a convertible note to be non-dilutive financing until that conversion happens. So it is debt until you have your qualified financing, and then it turns into, for example, Series A preferred shares. And at that point, it becomes dilutive. It actually becomes quite dilutive compared to the money that you take in from the venture capitalist on the Series A. All right, so let's take a look over at the safe note. For any of you that have not spent some time on the Y Combinator website or looked at some of the YouTube videos that they've put out about the Y Combinator cohorts and some of the things that they talk about that are important for entrepreneurs, you really should do it. It is fabulous. But what a safe note is, it stands for a simple agreement for future equity. And this is truly an equity instrument. And there are 3 versions of these safe notes, and this is directly, and you want to use the ones, if at all possible, directly from the Y Combinator website, because you can take their safe notes verbatim and they will have the same terms all the way through. And they're short documents, like 3 pages long. They're very easy to understand. And the 3 different variations on this are, you have a safe note that has a valuation cap but no discount, or you can have a different one that has a discount and no valuation cap, or you can have MFN, which is most favored nation status, no valuation cap and no discount. MFN simply means that there may be some terms on this note, and then if somebody comes in and you issue a safe note to them with better terms for the investor than what the original set of safe notes had, all safe notes in the tranche get the most favorable terms, which are usually going to be the last terms that come in. So that's what most favored nation status stands for. There's some other things that they have, such as the pro rata side letter. I won't bore you with what that's dealing with, or the safe users guide, but all of those things are available at their website. So I strongly encourage you to go take a look at that. So when you issue a safe note and you take the money from the investor, you've issued equity at that point, but it's going to be of the stock type of the next qualified financing. So at the stage you're all at right now, you can take a safe note, but you're not going to issue common stock. You're going to wait until there's a Series A preferred round initiated, and at that point you will issue Series A preferred stock to them, but it's considered to be equity at the time you take the money in. Now, the nice thing about these safe notes is they have a very simple effect on your cap table computations. And I'll give you an example. The post-money value capped type of note, you may put in, say, $50,000. An investor may put in $50,000 on a $5 million valuation post-money. And I'll show you what that means in just a minute. But that $50,000 on a $5 million means that's 1%. That person will own 1% of the company once you're done with that next qualified financing. So that makes everything super simple in doing your cap table computations. And you'll see why that gets pretty complicated as we get towards the end of this talk. All right, so let's take a look at some of the rounds and how we name the different rounds. The first one we now talk about is a pre-seed round. And this is usually a pretty small amount of money, maybe up to $250,000 or so. And we typically say that the funders of pre-seed rounds are friends, family, and fools. That's what the FF and F comes from. Then you go to a seed round. Now that's typically going to be a much larger amount of money, and that's going to come from angels and super angels. Almost exclusively, there will be no professional investors or institutional investors, also known as venture capitalists, at this point. That's super rare. Then you have your Series A preferred stock. Then a little bit later, you have Series B, and it just keeps going on and on and on until you have a liquidity event. Most of the time, a liquidity event is actually a positive thing. Your company gets acquired. That's a liquidity event. A liquidity event is really not an IPO, but an IPO effectively will do liquidity. It will provide the payback for the investors if that actually happens. But you typically have a lockup period that when you do your IPO, it takes at least 6 months for the existing investors to actually be able to cash out their shares. So the liquidity event is actually a little bit delayed in the event of an IPO. Now, you can also have a liquidity event where the business is wound up, meaning it's just dissolved, you went bankrupt. But most of the time when we talk about a liquidity event, it's a happy thing, and it's the fact that you actually got a return for your investors. So the key thing on all of these, once you've taken in investor money, their expectation is they're going to either get wiped out or they're going to get a big return. So you guys are in it to win at that point. You have to focus all of your efforts on making this business and their investment a success. All right, so let's take a little look at in more detail about different types of equity financing. So let's dive into the angel funding. It's actually very early. And I would tell you that 10 years ago, angel investors were $2,500 to maybe $25,000. Maybe they would pool some of that together. Today, you're seeing a pretty different environment. You can raise an angel funding round from $250,000 up to $5 million. I've seen it done and participated in rounds that are approaching $5 to $7 million that are angels and super angels. So that's becoming much more. The angels have moved into the space, the early stage space that used to be the early stage VCs did it. Now VC funds are so big, they're going to be pretty soon moving out of the Series A round, because at $8 million on a typical Series A round, that's just not enough money for them to put to work anymore. You can also do crowdsourcing, Indiegogo, Kickstarter, things like that. I've never seen it done in medical devices, because you can't give away part of your product at the point where you're taking crowdsourced money, like you would if you were doing a t-shirt business or something like that. So crowdsourcing, I wouldn't even want you to consider it. Then there's venture capital. And again, this always goes to Series A preferred or later shares. Venture capitalists will always require preferred stock. They will not take common stock because they like the additional features and benefits that are associated with the preferred rounds. So there will be multiple rounds, typically for a medical device type company, usually a Series B and a C. When we did Proxima, I'll show you at the end, we went all the way up to a Series E. I've seen them go as high as H. For example, if you're like CardioMEMS, which was a class 3 device, I mean, they went way out, like 9-10 rounds that they would require. But these rounds are going to be, for a Series A, it's going to be usually greater than $8 million. A Series B is probably today is going to be 15 to 20 million or more. You can actually go to pitchbook.com and find a lot of the ongoing venture capital financing stats right there on their website. You can download the reports just by giving them your email, and there's a lot of great info in there that lets you sort of establish what some of the expectations are for whatever round of financing you're going into and what market segment you're going into. There's also initial coin offerings. They've been done a decent amount in other spaces. I haven't seen it in medical devices, but you can also see SPACs. Now, for those of you who don't know what SPAC are, it's a special purpose acquisition company, and that's an existing public company that's there. It's got a bunch of money in it, and they go looking for an opportunity of a privately held company. They'll acquire it, and that effectively makes you public, and that's how you get your money. There are SPACs that have been done in medical devices, and some of them have gotten some really big valuations, but a lot of the burnish has been coming off some of the SPACs because there's been some real regulatory problems, not in our space, but in other spaces outside of healthcare. So I would probably just tell you that you're going to most often be doing venture capital financings once you get into the serious product development and commercialization, and that's fine. That's just the way it works. All right, so some of the terminology that you're going to hear when you start talking about equity financing There's pre-money valuation. And this is simply just what is the value of your company before the investment has been made. And we'll just call this company NewCo for new company. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that you have a pre-money value of $4 million and you have a group of angels that put $1 million into the company. So you have a pre-money of $4 million, you have a new investment of $1 million, that gives you a $5 million post-money valuation. And the angels now own 20% of the company because they've got $1 million out of the $5 million post-money value. That's pretty straightforward. There are other things that will start happening when you start taking investor money. Is they have a thing called liquidation preferences. And these are special rights that these shareholders get as part of them putting in money. And this is typically done in the preferred series A, B, C, and so forth. So they will ask for typically they get a specific payout. Let's say your company gets acquired later down the road, they're going to get their payout first before the common stockholders get any money whatsoever. So a typical example might be, let's say you have a 1x or a 2x preference for your Series A preferred stock. So if you had a 1x preference, then when you did, let's say you got bought, and say a venture company brought in, say, $5 million, they would get $5 million first. So if you're getting acquired for $10 million, they get $5 million right off the bat. If they had a 2x preference, they would get the full $10 million, and the common stockholders would get nothing. So you can see liquidation preference is one of the things you really want to pay attention to as you're doing your financing documents. There's something else that goes on to that you really also need to be concerned about, and this is called participation. And this is where the preferred shares, they get their preference, which you saw in the previous bullet point, but then they share pro rata in all the remaining cash that's left over after they take their preference. And this is really not good for you common stockholders. That's almost like getting your cake and eating it too. You're going to get, say, let's say the company now, the investors put in $5 million, and now you're getting a $15 million pay, acquired for $15 million, and there's a 2x preference. Well, the first $10 million will go to those Series A preferred shareholders. They then convert, and they owned, I think, 1/3 of the company at that point. They're going to get 1/3 of the remaining $5 million. So they get the preference and they get a portion of whatever's left over. That's really bad. Now, there's also non-participating preferred, where the VCs, they get either their preference or they get pro rata, but not both. This is good, because what that means is if a lot of money comes in and it's a big liquidity event, they'll just convert themselves to common stock, and then they'll share equally on a pro rata basis with all of the common stockholders, which are you as the founder. You're going to be the biggest common stockholders are going to be the founders. So non-participating preferred, that is absolutely the direction you want to go if you've got the leverage to be able to hold that. Okay, we're going to now take a quick look at angel equity financing and who are angels, so that you kind of understand where they're coming from, because this can be pretty important. Angels are usually very wealthy individuals or a family office or a group of individuals that typically like to invest really early before a company does its Series A preferred round. So that's going to be your seed round type folks. And again, they do typically small amounts relative to the amount of cash that we need, upwards of $5 million. They expect to get 15% to 1/3 of the company ownership. And they're going to push super hard. If they're putting in $3-4 million, they're going to demand a board seat. And I think it's okay to give them the board seat, but what you want to try to do is limit it to observer status if you can, meaning they can attend the board meetings, hear what the board's talking about and deciding about, but they have no vote on those types of activities. That's great. Or if you have to give them a board seat, you sunset it, meaning you make that board seat go away at the next qualified financing. So if you do a Series A after that, the angel investor now gets ejected from your board, and because you're going to end up taking 1 or 2 venture capitalists on your board at that time. And you want to try to keep your board smaller, more manageable. But this is a great way to do it, is just to sunset it. Always remember, these investors are pretty used to it taking a long time to get a return on their investment. And consequently, that's why they have a huge expectation for like a 20x type of return on their money. Now, angels won't lead around. And by leading around, that means they're not going to establish what the pre-money value for your company is. They're just not good at that. The venture capitalists, they do this for a living. So they will always like to lead around, and they'll establish what they consider to be the pre-money value for your company, or they'll say how much money is going to come in, and hence what's the post-money value of the company. Angels, because they're not good at valuations, they use safe notes and convertible notes as the vehicles to get the money into the company, because neither of those methods of bringing money into the company establish a valuation of the company. They kick that down the road for the venture capitalists to do it. And oftentimes the angels will syndicate to pool their financing together. And this is actually something that's really, really good to ask them to do, is you don't want to have like 100 shareholders that put in $2,500. That's really hard to manage over time. So let's take a couple of side notes on here. A lot of angel groups won't routinely pool their members' investments. And this was a real problem, for example, for the Atlanta Technology Angels, is a lot of their investors just didn't want to pool it. They wanted to have their name and their investment right there on the cap table. And they would only put in $2,500 out of a $2.5 million round. That's like 0.1% of the round, and they want to be an individual investor. So you get lots of these tiny little shareholders. It really complicates your cap table. It makes it very big, and getting shareholder votes, because some activities that you do, like a new qualified financing, are going to require a certain threshold of shareholder vote approval for it. And the more small investors you got, the harder it is to round them up and get those types of votes done and taken care of. So when possible, try to require pooling of all those small investors into a single investor LLC. With OB Medical, I actually ran 3 different investor LLCs. We put in money at 3 different times, and I pooled all of my folks together into those types of entities. And that actually gave me as an investor some a little bit of power to be able to go in and say, okay, since I've pooled all this together, made it really simple for you to manage the shareholders, I'm going to get a board seat on here. So that's what I did, looking at it from the investor side. It was good for the entrepreneur, because then they only had to manage me and not 35 other people. Try to keep your investment size large if at all possible. 25,000 would be great. Just dealing with people who are writing checks for $5,000, it's really sometimes more pain than it's worth. So try to keep a minimum investment size up if at all possible. And then in your stock purchase agreements, you want to call out what's a quote unquote major investor as somebody who puts in at least $250,000. Because what you can do in your stock purchase agreements is you can limit voting rights to just major shareholders. And that's another way that you can actually go in and say, only for the folks who put in a large amount of money, who are really big participants in the company, they're going to have voting rights on things. And the little investment folks, they're not going to. So that's another way that you can deal with it. You can't get them all pooled into an LLC. So once the major economic terms are agreed to, which really are, they're nothing more than the pre-money value, the cap that you're going to put on it, the interest rate, and the discount. Those are really the only 3 things that are on a convertible note or even a safe note. And a safe note really doesn't even have the interest rate on it. You then, once those terms are agreed to, because those are the economic terms, present them with your term sheet, which spells out all the other rights and obligations and things of both parties. And you can get your attorney to draft that up. That will make things much easier, because it's your terms, your agreement. You send it out to them. You'll get some pushback on some items, but it's much better to go with your term sheet rather than expect one of them to give you their term sheet, because they usually don't have their term sheet, as a matter of fact. Again, sunset those board seats, if any that they've got at Series A, and then that sets you up for looking at venture capital time. So this is always going to start after your seed round, and it's totally common to have multiple rounds. So Series A really is all about the activities, since it's a fairly modest amount of money, to do all of your early testing, your prototypes, and maybe preclinical studies if you have them. Series B is going to target actually the rest of the design process and the testing process to get your 510K filed. Or if you're de novo, then maybe you have to do a first-in-man or safety and performance study. Those can also, so a Series B can do that for a Class 2 or the first-in-man safety and performance early stuff, the first clinical stuff for a Class 3 device. Series C targets commercialization. If you're a Class 2 device, that means you're raising a lot of money, 20 million, for example. You're going to put on your own sales force, build a bunch of inventory, and really do a big product launch. Or the Series C will pay for most, if not all, of the pivotal trial that you have to do to get your PMA across the FDA. But if you're doing a Class 3, you're going to do at least a Series D, and that's going to allow you for a Class 3 to complete your PMA and get ready to start selling. Or you can do a big sales expansion if you have a Class 2 device. Quite frankly, most of the time on the Class 3 device, you will have gotten strategic investors, one of the big medical device companies. Let's say you're doing an orthopedic surgery device, and it's something that's going to be a Class 3. You would probably get a Synthes or a Medtronic or Smith & Nephew or Stryker, one of those big orthopedic companies, bring them in as a strategic investor. And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll put in a big chunk of that money, taking up a big part of your Series C or Series D, but they have something in there that it gives them the right, if they want to, they can buy your company when the PMA is issued. And that's what happened, for example, CardioMEMS. In fact, it happens to almost all of the Class 3 medical devices that were startups, is they just end up getting acquired at the PMA issuance. And that's good for them, because it usually takes about 10, 12 years to get to that point. If you ever do a down round, meaning that the share price on Series C is lower than the share price on Series B, that's going to trigger a lot of dilution, and that hurts primarily the common stockholders. They get hammered, and then the Series A in that particular case would also get hammered. So you want to do things that avoid down rounds if at all possible. All right, so this book is probably the best thing I've seen for explaining venture financing. It talks about all the different types of financing, the governance terms, the economic terms, and they give you examples of actual language that are in term sheets and stock purchase agreements and other important documents that are associated with doing venture capital deals. And they'll give you the pros and cons on all of them. So they'll explain things like the liquidation preference, the participation, full ratchets for any dilution protection, and they give you great examples. So I strongly encourage you to get this. Get the 4th edition. It's from 2019. There is no later one. And I just, in fact, bought this because the earlier version I had was from 2013. And there are some things that have changed in that time period. So this is a wholehearted recommendation for you guys, is that. So we're going to now close up by talking about cap tables, and I'm going to show you exactly what happens. Here's dilution in its most graphic form. So let's take a look at your startup. Let's say you're the founding CTO, and you're bringing on board at the same time a founding CEO, and you're going to issue 3 million shares of common stock, and you're going to divvy it up 60-40 between the CTO and the CEO. So there's your common stock distribution. The two of you own the entire company. And let's say you're on the faculty here from Georgia Tech, and you need to license your IP that you worked on in your lab to your startup from Georgia Tech. Well, typically what happens, and this is something I did when I licensed some IP out of Case Western Reserve, was I was able to limit them to 8% of the initial equity. So since I wasn't going to take shares away from myself and the CTO, we actually issued more shares that ended up being 8% of the new float. And in this case, almost 261,000 shares got issued to the university. So you see 8% is now going to the university. You can see the effective dilution is that 8% actually coming out of the founders. So you drop to 55% from 60 and to 37% from 40. That's not a bad hit. Now, it's time to take into account what's going to happen when investors want to put money in your company. And there's a very specific thing that dilutes the common stockholders. And this is, you have to create an option pool for any employees that you're going to start to hire. Investors all require it, and they require it to be established before they actually put money in the company, because they're going to ask for 20% of the total amount of common stock to be available for that stock option pool. Then you can use that to do equity incentive grants for new engineers and other people that you're hiring. So as you can see, we now had to issue another 800,000 shares to create this 20% stock option pool. So now you can see our CTO has gone from 60% ownership now down to 44%. He's not even a majority owner anymore, and this founding CEO has dropped from 40 to 30%. Now, what I would tell you is, at this early stage, I would argue extremely hard with that upcoming investor pool, which are probably going to be angels, that you do not need to do a 20% pool. Are you for, and you can show them, here's the hires we're going to do over the next 18 months, and here's the stock option grants that we intend to do. Here's the sort of the market rate for those sorts of stock option grants, and we only need to do, say, 12%. So are you for it? And come in with like a stock option budget, and that way you can limit how much dilution you're taking at this step as you get ready for the angel investors. So what happens when the angels show up? Well, as you can see, they're coming in now, and they're going to drop 500,000 into the company. So they're going to get 500,000 shares. They're going to own 11% of the company. And you can now see the founding CTO has now dropped to 39%, and the CEO is down to 26%. Just by them coming in, that stock option pool has gone from 20% to 18%. So, and you can see we're now up to like 4.5 million shares total, where we started off with just 3 million shares. So the angels come in on a convertible note, and I would just note that we're treating all of this as all of these investor shares as common stock on what is known as an as converted basis. And I would just refer you back to that book I showed you a couple of minutes ago. They'll explain this in probably better detail than I can in 30 seconds. So let's now take a look. You've done all that. You've gone through and done your proof of principle prototyping, and now you're ready to do your Series A with venture capitalists for the first time.
Hey, James, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm keeping an eye on the time here. I think we're maybe a minute or so over. So maybe if we could sort of some final final notes here. I know some people have got to jump pretty soon.
Yeah, sure. All right. So let me just pop it over to the next one. So after you go through and you do 3 different series, what you see is you now, as the CTO, you own 8%, and the CEO, you own 5%. This sounds atrocious, right? You went from 60-40 to 8 and 5. Here's the thing. When you owned 60% of the company as the founder, the value of that company was 0, absolutely 0. And when you got it to this point at Series C, it's actually got a tangible value. It maybe is 120 million or so. So maybe you own now just 8% of 120 million. It's like 12 million bucks. So that's pretty good. You're now owning something that's worth something. And I can tell you from my own experience, where I owned 100% of Focal Therapeutics when its value was 0, and I was in the high single digits when we got it acquired. This is exactly what typically will happen. So this is this is the last slide. So this is just what we did in Proxima Therapeutics. We raised 50 million in VC. The share prices were $1, $2.40 a share, $2.40 a share, $4.80 a share, and $7.20 a share. We sold it for 200 million. So our Series A shareholders got a 14.2x return, and the Series E shareholders got a 2x return, which was totally fair because Series A took them 8 years to get that return. In the Series E, it only took them about 9 months to get a 2x return. So everybody was really happy with that.
But maybe I'll just start with a kind of a broad question. Maybe this will just be kind of one to tie us off here. I love your conversations about cap tables and valuation, how that looks pre and post money. And I'm wondering, when you're especially at the early stages and you're talking to maybe the first investors that would give you a valuation, how do you know what's fair, I guess? Like, how do you know kind of what to negotiate with and what your pre-money valuation would be?
Okay, so there's kind of two parts to that question. So if you're talking to an investor and they're wanting to put a pre-money value on the company, that's by definition, you're talking to venture capital. So you're doing like a Series A. You need to have some idea of what companies that are at your level of product development or wherever you are in your corporate life. You got to understand kind of what is the market for, medical devices and stuff like that. You can get an idea of that at PitchBook. They actually will show for medical devices quarter by quarter what the median and average seed round pre-money values are and how much money was raised in those rounds. And they'll do it for Series A, B, C, and D, and E. So you can look at that and you can see, and you say, like our market is probably bigger than average. Maybe we think it's like $500 million market revenue opportunity. So we think it's bigger than your usual opportunity. So we think we ought to be valued, and we've done all of their, we've shown proof of principle with some, let's just say some benchtop, rodent studies or something like that. We think we're in the 75th percentile. So you can go to the PitchBook data and see that the median value, pre-money value, maybe it was 6 million, and the 75 percentile was more like 12. And you say, okay, we think we're worth 12 for pre-money value. So that's the most concrete, most supportable way to do it. A lot of times the VCs are just going to throw a number at you and see if you're willing to bite on it. Because you can't do like discounted cash flow and stuff like that at the stage where you're not generating any cash. So the usual metrics that are used for valuing ongoing businesses just don't apply.
Fair enough. Yeah, that makes sense.